Usa is a miserable virgin who simps after a smoking hot baddie that doesn't even know he exists. However, everything changes after he moves into her dorm and uses every trick in the book for a chance to smash, but her freaky roommates keep getting in the way. This story starts with Yusa going to return several books to the library and becoming entranced as soon as he sees a nonchalant baddie named Kawaii reading a book. He immediately sneaks behind the shelves to drool over her, but a friend named Kagami interrupts to ask if he is really getting his own place. After explaining how he practically forced his parents to give him money for a small room, he sees that she has already left and heads out to find the hostel. Minutes later, he arrives at a part of town filled with old houses and thinks his life will now be filled with wholesome nostalgia, until he spots a creep named Shiroaki trying to spy on students. When Shiroaki suddenly calls his name, he panics and tries to call the cops, but one luckily shows up right then, so he takes off and runs all the way to the hostel. Once there, he sees the landlady Sumiko, who then gives him a tour of the house before taking him to a large room. Upon seeing this, Yusa gets shocked and says he expected it to be smaller. But then Sumiko slides a plastic wall right down the middle and explains that he will actually be sharing it with someone else. The next moment, Shiroaki grabs his shoulder and welcomes him, but he almost passes out from shock and decides to go back to the comfort of his parents' house. That is, until he gets to the door and sees the beautiful face he fell in love with at school. Upon hearing that Kawaii also has a room in the house, he starts unleashing every pickup line in his arsenal until she suddenly pulls a wooden sword on him and says he can't enter the ladies section. Sumiko then explains that guys are not allowed to get close to chicks, so they don't turn her house into a freaky breeding ground. Minutes later, Yusa calls his mom to ask for more money for a better place, but she responds by verbally assaulting him until he hangs up and decides to accept his fate. After having tea with Sumiko and learning more about their way of life in the hostel, he waits at the edge of the girls' hallway to stalk Kawaii, but Shiroaki shows up at the worst possible moment to ruin his fun. Yusa then spends the next few days putting up with his daily dose of insanity and eventually adapts so well to the point that Shiroaki finally decides to have a normal conversation with him. When he commends him on being so chill and says he will have no trouble with the others in the hostel, Yusa tells him to reduce his expectations because Kawaii hasn't even acknowledged the fact that he exists. While talking about how she is always so expressive with everyone else, Shiroaki shows him a photo of another housemate called Mayumi, but then Sumiko shows up to ask for a favor and ends up fulfilling the shameless creep's fantasies by cussing him out. Upon seeing this, Yusa heads out to clean his mind with fresh air and reaches the beach just in time to watch a chick lose it over her cheating boyfriend. At first, he tries to enjoy the show, but after seeing that she is also extremely drunk, he rushes over to stop her from falling into the water and realizes that it's actually Mayumi. The next moment, she presses her gravity-defying assets into his chest and asks if he would like to have his first time with her. But Kawaii suddenly whacks her on the head and warns him to stay away whenever she is drunk. When she suddenly climbs to the top of the stairs to slide all the way back down, Kawaii decides to stop acting nonchalant and storms up the stairs to beat some sense into her head. However, while beating her up, her foot slips and they both end up crashing into poor Yusa's face. Shortly after this, Sumiko loses it and scolds Mayumi for being so irresponsible before asking why she is even back from the trip with her boyfriend. After they all listen to another breakdown, Sumiko prepares dinner, but while eating, Yusa's jaw starts to hurt. So Kawaii apologizes for breaking it before Mayumi offers to let him grab her milkers as a reward for breaking their fall. While having breakfast several days later, Sumiko asks everyone for their holiday plans, and Yusa quickly realizes that he doesn't have a life outside his obsession with Kawaii. Sumiko then explains that she will be gone for most of the day to handle personal business and places Kawaii in charge of the house before leaving. Minutes later, Shiroaki tries to make Yusa interested in his new invention, but Yusa completely ignores him and says he would rather wallow in self-pity than hang out with a creep. Shiroaki then promises that they will just be going to buy some glycerin at the store, but Yusa still refuses to spend even a minute with him and leaves to grab a soda. On his way back to the room minutes later, he stops at the girls' hallway and wonders how Mayumi is doing since she barely comes out, but then she suddenly starts crawling toward him, causing him to almost piss his pants. The next moment, she starts talking about how meaningless life is, so he crouches down to offer moral support but quickly realizes that she is way past the point of having a rational conversation. However, when Shiroaki starts yelling for them to come out, they find him playing with bubbles, and Mayumi immediately forgets that she wanted to hang herself. As they continue running around with the bubbles, Kawaii returns from the library and freezes in shock the moment she sees Mayumi in a large one. Yusa notices this and asks if she wants to join the fun, but she immediately switches back to android mode and acts like she is too mature for such nonsense. However, instead of going inside, she sits right there on the porch and starts twitching until Yusa notices and makes it sound like she would be doing them a favor by playing along. The moment they pull up a bubble around her, her face lights up and causes Yusa's heart to skip multiple beats. But then it pops and some of the soap gets inside her mouth. She then tries to rub it off her tongue, but Yusa's unholy mind pictures receiving the Gok 5000, so he immediately drops to hide his Excalibur. Unfortunately, Mayumi and Shiroaki realize his current predicament and start teasing him until Kawaii realizes and resets his brain with a nasty slap. Days later, Yusa ends up struggling for dear life on the floor as Mayumi forces Shiroaki to make out with him since they refuse to watch a horror movie with her. When Sumiko finally shows up and asks for the reason behind her insanity, she tells them how a co-worker wouldn't shut up about her perfect relationship until it reopened the scars in her broken heart. Out of pity, Sumiko proceeds to turn the entire house into a horror movie set so she can really enjoy the movie. But as soon as Kawaii notices, she decides to return to the safety of her books. However, after they all start cooking up ghost stories to scare her, she sees that the hallway leading to her room now looks like a portal to hell. So she ends up staying for the movie but continues hiding her face with a pillow. Yusa then takes the opportunity to display his manliness until a single scene from the movie causes him to lose bladder control right beside her. After, Mayumi takes her out to use the restroom and tries to show her that there is nothing to be scared of. But as soon as they get to the corner, a mysterious creature attacks Mayumi. Yusa quickly rushes over with Sumiko and Shiroaki to help, but they end up frozen in shock as a psychotic chick named Saiaka tries to squeeze the life out of Mayumi's melons. Minutes later, she introduces herself to Yusa and claims to be a perfectly normal chick who just gets extremely excited around her friends. Upon realizing that her beauty is reducing his brain's processing power, Mayumi tells him to snap out of it because Saiaka is actually a creepy psycho, but Yusa becomes convinced that she is the first normal person he has met since he moved into the hostel. Days later, Yusa empties his savings account for a new bike and tries to enjoy the feeling of his first independent purchase, but Mayumi and Shiroaki steal it away for a quick ride. After getting it back, he loses it and calls her insensitive for taking a double ride on it before he even got the chance to test it out. She then tries to mock him by boasting about how she always took double rides in school, but a sudden wave of depression shuts her up as she realizes that high school was the highlight of her life. The next moment, Shiroaki turns the backseat into one of his cultured experiments, and as Yusa tries to pull the rope off, Kawaii returns with Saiaka. Upon seeing the bike, Saiaka asks Kawaii if she would like to ride with him to school every day, and Yusa immediately claims to be okay with it. But after taking one look at the seat, Kawaii shuts him down and heads to her room. As he begins to understand how Mayumi feels about getting her heart broken, Saiaka notices and asks if he actually has feelings for Kawaii, but he denies it and claims that he was only being nice before running inside to avoid more questions. The next morning, she meets him outside and actually manages to have a conversation that lasts more than 10 seconds. Instead of taking his first win in ages, our desperate MC decides that it's the perfect time to shoot his shot. So he once again offers to take her to school, but she shuts him down with an ice-cold stare that shatters the remaining fragments of his already damaged heart. After apologizing for thinking she would want to go out with him, he quickly rides off to hide his embarrassment, and she suddenly starts feeling bad. The next moment, Saiaka and Mayumi start teasing her about it, so she reminds them that the hostel actually belongs to her family, which gives her the right to triple their rent whenever she wants. At school later that day, Yusa ends up with library duty again and prays that he doesn't run into her as usual. But as soon as he enters, she walks up to him and apologizes for the brutal rejection before explaining that she just doesn't want to be teased for riding to school with a guy. Upon seeing the amount of effort she is putting in just to explain herself, Yusa tells her not to worry about it anymore, so she returns to her usual emotionless state. Later that evening, Yusa returns from an errand and finds Sumiko bouncing on Shirosaki's spine while Saiaka desperately tries to get her hands on Mayumi's plot cannons. Mayumi then covers up and tells him to stop staring, before seeing that he has actually been looking at Kawaii and suddenly dislocating his jawbone for not giving her any attention. After making sure his face is still intact, he walks over to Kawaii to ask why she is crying, but she claims it's nothing and walks off. The next moment, Mayumi receives a call, but when she starts freaking out over it, they all realize that it must be her cheating ex and watch as she transforms from independent baddie to shameless simp, all because he sent a text, asking to hear her voice. The next day, Mayumi suddenly starts using skincare again, so Shiroaki asks if her ex's magnum was really that good, but she still claims to be in control of the situation before running off to take another call. Upon seeing this, Yusa accepts that she is a lost cause, But when he returns from school later that evening and sees her about to go on a date, he decides to make one last effort to save her. However, even after he reminds her of all the pain she just healed from and says Sumiko will be making her favorite meal for dinner, she still claims it's just a quick date to hear what her ex has to say. On the way out, she runs into Kawaii, who then asks if she is actually happy. But this catches her off guard since Kawaii has never been interested in her dating life. Shortly after that, she meets up with Prince Charming for their date, but barely a couple minutes into it, he starts asking if she wants to go back to his place for dessert. She initially tries to play it off, but he continues insisting until she suddenly remembers what self-respect is and tells him to forget about ever experiencing her divine again. The following evening, Yusa returns from school and gets shocked when he sees a guy getting rough with Saiaka. As soon as he tries to say something, Saiaka runs over to him and apologizes to her suitor for making him think she could ever have feelings for an NPC. However, this causes him to suspect that Yusa stole her heart away, so he grabs Yusa's shirt and threatens to make him swallow all his teeth. As Yusa tries to defuse the situation, Saiaka proceeds to make matters worse by acting like she actually has a special relationship with him. Thankfully, Kawaii suddenly throws her book at the guy's back, but instead of following through and defending Yusa, she claims the book slipped out of her hand and walks right inside like nothing happened. Goldilocks then resumes his threats and asks if he is also playing with Kawaii's heart. So Yusa tries to explain that he is actually a virgin who still struggles to talk to chicks, but Shiroaki shows up right on time to save him from losing more aura points. When Yusa eventually meets up with Kawaii and thanks her for trying to save him with the book, she tells him not to worry about it, but he takes it a step further and continues yapping about how great she is until the embarrassment causes her to get pissed. After she walks off, he gets worried that he just blew his last shot with her until Saiaka starts talking about how she is lonely and just doesn't know how to take a compliment. With his confidence restored, Yusa runs off to plan his next pickup line, and just as Mayumi tells Saiaka to stop playing with his head, Sumiko gently grabs her face and says she is a step away from homelessness. After school the following day, Yusa waits for Kawaii at the intersection and acts like he just happened to be leaving school at the exact same time to avoid looking desperate. Naturally, she quickly catches on to his pathetic attempt at being slick and decides to ignore it, but he continues running his mouth about random stuff, so she asks if he caught a flat tire to give him a subtle hint that she wants to be left alone. Unfortunately, his prehistoric brain cells stop him from processing basic information, so she reluctantly closes her book to hear him out, causing him to believe that Saiaka was completely right. At the hostel a couple hours later, Sumiko asks if they will be interested in the drink she got from a friend, and when Mayumi turns it down, they all act like a ghost just walked in because she literally inhales vodka for breakfast. Kawaii immediately asks if she is seeing another two-timing jerk, but she claims to just be paying more attention to her health. Upon hearing this, Saiaka complains that her melons won't feel as good if she starts dropping weight, so Mayumi promises to lose every pound of fat left just to make sure she has nothing to grab again. The next moment, she receives a call and claims it's just a friend, so Sumiko starts pouring drinks for Saiaka and Shiroaki while she takes the call. Moments later, she bangs the phone and snatches Shirosaki's drink before knocking him out with the cup and saying that she hates the chicks in her friend group. When they ask why she just fractured Shirosaki's skull, she explains how she actually started losing the weight to hang out with her hot friend who seemed to have the perfect relationship. But the same friend just called off their hangout plans because she also got dumped. After admitting that she didn't actually have to attack Shiroaki, she accepts that not all friendships are meant to last, and Saiaka immediately claims to understand how she feels. But Sumiko tells her to stop the cap because all her relationships are built around her psychotic need for validation and pleasure. Saiaka then says she at least tries to have a relationship, unlike a certain bookworm that obsesses over fictional mafia daddies. Upon hearing this, Captain Sensalot immediately steps in to defend Kawaii, but then she explains how she basically chose to become an antisocial Wattpad addict because having a simple conversation with real people felt impossible. A little while later, Yusa tells Shiroaki that Kawaii might actually be suffering from loneliness with the hope that he can give some advice, but he forgets that Mayumi just damaged his brain and learns the hard way when he starts revealing his plans to creep on college baddies. At school the next day, Yusa resumes the usual stalking, but unlike all the other times, he convinces himself that Kawaii desperately wants human connection despite clearly seeing how peaceful she looks while reading. As soon as school closes for the day, he catches up to her on the way home and forces himself to ignore the obvious disgust in her face. So she asks if he is doing all this because of what she said the previous night. She then explains that she actually prefers being by herself. But once again, he convinces himself that she just needs to get comfortable around him. Upon seeing the enthusiasm on his face, she asks if he ever gets tired of keeping up with everyone else at the hostel, and when he says it actually feels nice to connect with them, she realizes that he has always been a weirdo, which is probably why he blended in so easily. She then puts some distance between them with the hope that he will finally get the message, but homeboy becomes delirious with ecstasy as he decides to go all out until she opens up to him. As the week progresses, he sticks to his plan and somehow fails to see how frustrated she is gradually becoming, while Mayumi and Saiaka try to figure out how long it will take for Kawaii to lose it. After school that day, he waits at the usual spot to walk her home, but after several minutes of looking out, he decides to go check the bookstore in case she got lost in another novel. As expected, he finds her buried in a new book and decides to bring her back to reality, but then two chicks suddenly give her a jump scare before reminding her that they were once in the same school. As they start a conversation about the good old days, Yusa watches from the corner and realizes that she actually has a life. However, when the girls finally leave, Kawaii locks eyes with him while waving them goodbye and immediately runs away. Confused, Yusa quickly runs after her and tries to make things less awkward by talking about how her friends seemed really chill, but then she stops and finally reveals the anger he has been too stupid to notice. At the house later on, Mayumi finds him sobbing on the ground and threatens to walk on his skull, but he tells her to go ahead, causing her to realize what is going on since she has experienced her fair share of humiliation in the pursuit of love. She then tells him to never believe a word Saiaka says because she's been playing with his head ever since the night she first showed up. He then scolds her for not telling him sooner, and she immediately kicks him in the face for being so stupid that he couldn't take the countless hints Kawaii gave him. Days later, Yusa finally gets tired of acting like Kawaii's bodyguard, but still decides to enjoy walking beside her. Minutes later, they arrive at the hostel and freeze in shock at the entrance because Saiaka is currently trying to suck faces with Mayumi. However, Yusa quickly accepts the insanity unfolding in front of him and decides to enjoy the show. So Kawaii tells Saiaka that she should be doing it in the privacy of her room. Saiaka then tells her to shut up, but the strong smell of booze nearly fries off Kawaii's nose, so she asks why they are both drunk in the afternoon. After explaining that she actually found Saiaka in this state when she returned, Mayumi begs her to stop, but Saiaka tells her to stop acting stubborn because it's just a harmless kiss. Just as she gets close enough to slobber on Mayumi's face, Sumiko wraps her head in plastic and says it will be best if she joins her ancestors on the other side. Minutes later, she pours out a cup of tea to help her ease up and asks why she was drinking all by herself. So Saiaka explains how she ran into her ex while going out with friends. To avoid an awkward conversation, she forced a smile for him, but he misunderstood and thought it was the perfect opportunity to remember what she tastes like. So she cracked his baby factory with her shoes and tried to kiss Mayumi to rub off his kiss. When Mayumi suddenly says guys always have trouble forgetting about their ex, Yusa and the girls ask why she is acting like she can relate when she is the one always running back to her toxic exes. She then tries to defend herself by claiming that she easily overwrites every guy she meets after their relationship fails, but then Saiaka explains that it's the reason she keeps falling for the same trick with multiple guys because she never takes the time to learn their tricks. Upon hearing this, Kawaii offers her support for Sayaka's theory and says it's probably why her brain goes numb whenever an ex calls. But Saiaka suddenly turns on her and says she is even worse. Unlike any regular girl who would just cram every bit of information about their suitor into one folder, she always overanalyzes the smallest detail until she eventually gets tired and returns to being a miserable loner. To redeem herself, Kawaii claims that she is at least better than Mayumi since she doesn't have any toxic history, but Saiaka reminds her that it's because she has no experience with guys. Upon hearing this, Yusa becomes even more obsessed since he might be the first to pop her cherry, and this suddenly gives Saiaka an idea, so she tries to kiss Kawaii. To no one's surprise, Yusa rushes in to save her lips, but he ends up getting a kiss on the arm and passes out. Kawaii, on the other hand, gets extremely embarrassed and runs off to her room, so he chases after her, while Sumiko tells Saiaka to prepare for another punishment. Moments later, she sees Yusa still waiting in the hallway to see Kawaii, so she tells him to stop worrying so much about the way she reacts to everything, but he continues thinking he might have scared her off again. At the dinner table hours later, they both struggle to even look in each other's direction until Mayumi loses it and tells them to get a room because she is tired of watching them act stupid. The following afternoon, Yusa makes it back home in time to get sprayed from a water gun by Mayumi, who then tells him to stop acting like her plot cannons don't excite him. He then asks if she is too broke to get matching plot armor, so she throws the gun in his face before Shiroaki tells him to join them. He initially tries to say no, but when Mayumi tells him that Kawaii is having more fun than the both of them, he immediately imagines what she looks like in a silk swimsuit, causing Mayumi to get even more upset. Just then, Kawaii shows up in a raincoat, so Mayumi tries to apologize for getting his hopes up but sees that he is even more obsessed with her. After drying off a couple hours later, Yusa finds one of Kawaii's books on the table and decides to see why she is so obsessed with reading. Barely a couple minutes into it, she also comes out to grab the book but gets shocked to see him reading, so she asks why he is trying out something clearly beyond the limits of his pea-sized brain. He then admits that most of her books are way too complex, but says this particular one is actually easy to understand. When he starts explaining how funny a certain scene was, her emotions slowly flare up, as she never imagined that he would like something she is interested in, so she tells him to keep reading and runs off to hide her smile. The next afternoon, she finds him on the porch reading again and asks how far he has gotten. But when he tries to talk about it, Mayumi suddenly kicks him off the porch and asks why he is trying so hard to impress her. He then scolds her for always trying to ruin his plans and forgets that Kawaii is still listening to every word until she realizes that he was never interested and walks off. Hours later, they all get bored at the dinner table, so Sumiko asks Kawaii if she can talk about one of her books, but she immediately refuses and says she doesn't want to give Shiroaki new ideas for his cultured fantasies. Sumiko then tells Shiroaki to come up with a random story since he has experience writing novels, but the lack of active cells in his brain stops him from getting any ideas, so Mayumi decides to bless them with her genius mind. After she starts a random story about an old geezer forcing his wife to power up his shaver, they all take turns adding stuff to it and end up turning it into Yusa's worst nightmare as the old couple decides to oil him up for unholy activities. By the end of story time, Shiroaki begins to feel inspired and decides to write another novel. But while Yusa starts yawning and says he needs to sleep for a week without breaks. When Shiroaki asks if it's because he spent all night reading Kawaii's novel, her stomach butterflies come back to life, but she decides to ignore them and gets up to leave. However, Yusa stops her to ask a question about the book, and she ends up having an exciting conversation with him, so Sumiko holds Mayumi and Saiaka back to stop them from ruining his moment. The next moment, some of Yusa's thoughts on the book start to oppose Kawaii's, so he desperately tries to get back on the same page with her, but a panic attack causes his nervous system to crash. While he starts cussing himself out for fumbling another perfect opportunity, Mayumi and the others wonder if he is actually blind because Kawaii has been smiling this entire time. On the way back from school a couple days later, Yusa apologizes to Kawaii for being late on his rent, but she tells him not to worry because Mayumi and Saiaka also miss payments sometimes. The next moment, they hear singing and find him loading bamboo onto the back of a truck. Once back at the house, he explains that he actually got it from a friend of Sumiko's after he helped them cut it down. And when Mayumi asks if he wants to craft a wish tree, Saiaka tells her not to bother waiting for it because no amount of wishing can cure her obsession with deadbeat guys. While she chases Saiaka around the compound, Shiroaki tells Yusa that he just wants to make something for the local students to play with. The next moment, Sumiko tells him to come take a call from the cops, and he almost pisses himself when the girls say he is probably about to get locked up for life. However, after taking the call, he tells them about a lost purse he submitted at the station days ago and says the owner is actually coming over tomorrow to thank him. Sumiko then says he might finally have a chance at finding love because the purse clearly belongs to a girl, but it ends up being one of the local students. As her mom tries to thank him for finding the purse, Yusa tries to figure out why she seems so uncomfortable, so Saiaka reminds him that Shiro has a thing for middle-aged baddies. Sensing the tension, Sumiko offers to give Chinatsu some pudding, and just as her mom tries to decline, she tells her to leave and says she would like a serving. Several minutes later, Shiroaki continues his bamboo project, and when Chinatsu abandons her pudding to ask about it, they end up having an extremely long conversation until she finally agrees to leave with her mom. As they both walk off, Shiroaki tells Yusa that she will probably never come over since she obviously has other friends to hang out with, but the very next day, she shows up to ask if he is done with the mini playground. He then explains that grown folk have other things to do with their time and asks why she isn't hanging out with her friends. So she explains how lame they all are and offers to keep coming over until he finishes the playground. Several days later, they both get amazed by how good it's looking, and while exchanging ideas for the final designs, they fail to notice Yusa and the others who have been secretly watching to figure out what Chinatsu sees in someone who prides himself on being an unhinged creep. They then agree that there is nothing to worry about since he mostly acts like a big brother to her, but then Chinatsu suddenly admits that she has feelings for him. Like that isn't enough, Shiroaki also says he likes her, but just as Yusa and the girls consider calling the cops, he tells her to save her feelings for a couple years from now. After he heads inside to help Sumiko with a chore, Mayumi decides to set her straight and proceeds to explain how she is way too inexperienced to handle a freak like Shiro. Chinatsu then tells her to mind her own business, but she ignores this and claims they are in an extremely freaky relationship, so Chinatsu asks if she is going for him because none of the guys her age want anything to do with a washed up. The next moment, Mayumi loses it and says she will never have friends if she keeps obsessing over creeps like Shiroaki. But this surprisingly strikes a chord in Chinatsu's heart, so she runs off with tears pouring out of her eyes. Upon seeing this, Yusa and Kawaii get disgusted by how immature she is while she desperately tries to explain herself. During dinner the following evening, Shiroaki gets worried because she didn't show up as usual, so Saiaka decides to drop a hint about what happened. The next moment, Mayumi blames Yusa for what happened to Chinatsu, but she still ends up explaining how it all went down and says she never expected Chinatsu to have such strong feelings for him. They then tell him not to worry because she will definitely come back again, but after days of not seeing her, Yusa tries to figure out what she saw in Shiroaki while walking home with Kawaii when they see Chinatsu waiting by herself at a corner. Yusa considers talking to her, but then he sees 3 girls walking up and decides to wait in case they are her friends. However, when they run right past her as if she has the plague, they both realize that she actually has no friends and return home to tell the others that it was probably why she got so emotional. Hours later, Chinatsu's mom shows up at the front door to ask for their help because she hasn't returned since school closed, so they all head out to find her. Just as Yusa grabs his bike and tells Sumiko where he plans to search, they hear something in the bushes, so he walks over and sees that she has been hiding there this entire time. Minutes later, they get back to the house, but Sumiko explains that she has to stay a little longer since her mom went extremely far to look for her. Mayumi then decides to only say things that will make her feel better, but that plan immediately goes south when she says that no one needs friends. Naturally, Saiaka immediately asks if it's because she also failed to have regular relationships, but Mayumi doubles down and grabs Kawaii to prove her point about being a loner. When Chinatsu asks if it's really that good, Kawaii tries to explain how nice it feels to live in her own bubble, but Chinatsu tells her not to bother because her life already sounds depressing. Kawaii then realizes that she can never be an introvert and says the reason her friends are avoiding her is definitely because of something she did. Chinatsu then tells them about the day she got in a bad mood over her grades and lost at the moment one of the girls showed up to talk about watching anime. After she ran off to cry, everyone else started shutting her out until she became an outcast. Upon hearing this, Kawaii explains that they probably felt bad because of the way she disrespected their favorite activity. The next moment, Mayumi tells her to get them some candy and apologize, but she claims it's not that simple because literally everyone at school now avoids her. After saying that she can't put up with the rejection any longer, she starts crying and asks God to take her back. But Sumiko immediately slaps the will to live back into her skull and serves her a bowl of pudding before explaining how she has to work hard to fix her relationships. Shiroaki then promises to complete their project by the weekend so she can bring her friends over, causing her to get excited again. Days later, she walks in with her friends and happily reveals that they have finally made up, so Shiroaki then takes them to the yard for the launch of his noodle dispensing contraption, and after they spend most of the day playing with it, Sumiko whips up a huge pudding bowl for them to share. A couple nights later, Sumiko calls the gang together to look at a memo shared to all the locals about a creep who recently started flashing chicks as Magnum and trying to grab their plots in public. After reading all the details, they all turn on Shiroaki as he fits the description almost perfectly. But the shameless creep reaches climax just from their hateful stares. While talking about how they all hate creeps moments later, Saiaka reveals how one tried to grab her monstrous melons on the bus a couple days ago. Mayumi then says the poor guy was probably disappointed since she usually wears multiple melon wraps to hide how small they are. As Saiaka immediately starts chasing her around the compound, Yusa asks Kawaii if she has ever experienced something like that. And when she says no, the girls stop and ask if she is being serious. She then reminds them that she never takes the bus or train just to enjoy her books. But then Saiaka explains how a plus-sized creep once intentionally brushed up against her in a bookstore, after she suddenly panics. Mayumi also remembers how some random creep grabbed her cakes while she was reading in a library years ago, causing her to get even more terrified. Upon seeing this, Yusa realizes that she must have experienced it before and asks when, but she completely denies it, so Sumiko forbids her from reading on the way home since it's clearly why she never noticed what was happening. Kawaii then tries to beg for her reading privileges back, but Sumiko stands on business until she says Yusa will be watching her on the way back from school. The following afternoon, our love-struck Mki tries to act nonchalant when she finally catches up to him for the walk home, but just a couple minutes into it, he loses himself in her beauty and wishes they can stay like this forever. Upon getting to the zebra crossing, he starts paying even more attention than usual, but then he notices a tingling sensation in his pants and realizes that he is no better than the wanted creep. So he takes a moment to gather his thoughts. 3 nights later, Mayumi starts teasing him because they can all tell that she is giving him blue balls. But when Saiaka tells him to stop following her around like a simp, he claims to be okay with it since it means helping Kawaii enjoy the best part of her day. The following morning, they all find out that the creep got arrested, and while he gets upset since he now has to stop being her bodyguard, she gets excited to finally read in peace again and quickly runs to the library. After getting caught staring at her perfect legs, Yusa ends up cleaning the entire place with Sumiko until evening and starts wondering why Kawaii isn't back yet. Just as he convinces himself that she is probably still reading, 2 girls run up to Sumiko and say there's another creep waiting at the underground passage Kawaii usually takes on the way home. Several minutes later, she starts heading home, and as soon as she enters the underground passage, the creep jumps out with his meat stick swinging in the air, but she walks past him without even realizing. He then tries to stop her, but Yusa smacks his hand away and tries to insult his shrimp, only to see that they are both brothers in size. When Mayumi also shows up to stop him, Saiaka crushes his nuts with a nasty heel kick right before Shiroaki unleashes his bandage skills to tie him up. After the cops show up to arrest him, they return home, but then Yusa stops Kawaii to scold her for being careless. When she claims it was something she could easily take care of, he tells her to practice on him with a simple insult, but she gets embarrassed and walks off. The next moment, she thanks him for everything and promises to be more careful before making him enter the girls' section just so she can beat him up with a wooden sword. A couple days into summer break, Yusa gets bored of laying around all day and considers getting a part-time job. But after seeing Kawaii, who just got back from the library, he remembers that he is already a full-time simp and walks over to ask about the story. Despite receiving an ice-cold response, he goes a step further to ask for book recommendations since he doesn't have anything else to do, so she agrees and heads inside to avoid any further interruption. He then continues walking around to find something fun to do and eventually stumbles on Sumiko, who just passed out from the excessive heat. Hours later, she promises it was just the heat and asks if they can go eat at her friend's restaurant. So they all force Shiro to act as the designated wallet before heading out. At the restaurant several minutes later, Sumiko meets up with her friend Ta, who then explains how running her second cafe has been difficult ever since her usual part-timer quit the job. After explaining how she needs someone who can handle being around weird people with ease, they enter the dining room and watch as Yusa suddenly switches personalities and becomes the adult in charge of controlling his psychotic housemates. Upon realizing that he is the perfect option for her cafe, she waits until they finish eating before explaining the job offer to him. To make it sound much better, she claims that all the other employees are exciting and unique people, but this ends up having the opposite effect as he immediately turns her down and says he has dealt with enough unique people for one lifetime. Ta then tries to change his mind by telling him about the nicknames her other workers gave themselves, but he still refuses to work at the cafe. So Sumiko asks if he forgot about the time everyone in school called him Freak Show. As soon as the words leave her mouth, he tells her to stop talking, but Mayumi gets curious and starts coming up with random explanations that all make him sound worse than Diddy. When Saiaka also grabs his phone to text all the details to his contacts, he begs them to stop and starts by explaining how his parents always had abnormal friends. As a result of this, he learned to easily coexist with weirdos and creeps, but this skill came at the cost of his reputation in school because he could only maintain friendships with the most diabolical characters, which is why everyone started calling him Freak Show. As the girls immediately start laughing uncontrollably, he thanks God that Kawaii isn't like them, but after she also breaks character to laugh at him, he storms home pissed and stands on his decision to never work for Ta. However, she still shows up the very next day and forces him into a fancy uniform with help from Sumiko. Just as he tries to turn her down again, Kawaii shows up and freezes with her eyes lit up as she never expected him to look so good in a traditional outfit. He notices this and immediately plays it cool, but she snaps herself out of La La Land and hands over a bunch of books she picked out for him. He then realizes that she stayed up late just to choose them for him and gets excited to read them. But then Tae and Sumiko decide to help him look even better by tying the books together. Once again, Kawaii loses her senses because of how good he looks, so he agrees to work for Ta since it's the only way he can get that reaction out of her. The following day, Shiroaki asks Yusa why he is wearing his uniform in the house instead of waiting till he gets to the restaurant. So he claims to have suddenly developed an interest in traditional outfits. However, upon seeing that Kawaii has been staring at him, he quickly turns away to hide the fact that he is just desperate for her attention. Several minutes later, he arrives at the restaurant and meets Ta, who then explains that he will be working at a cafe at the back as a replacement for her favorite part-timer. After she gives him a name tag, some employees from the regular section come out to wish him luck before she leads him to the back, where he meets the first weirdo named Yamamoto. While the pretend samurai immediately starts running his mouth, Kawaii wonders why such a legendary name would belong to a dweeb until Tai reveals that it's not even his real name. Moments later, the yap session continues as Yamamoto leads him inside, but when another employee named Kurokawa tells him to stop, Yusa breathes a sigh of relief and thinks he has finally met a regular person. Unfortunately, his hopes get dashed when Kurokawa suddenly starts rambling on about his guardian spirit, causing Yusa to remember an old friend named Hayashi, who spent every waking moment talking about ghosts. Back at the house that night, he becomes depressed and complains about how life always gets hard for him, but Mayumi immediately tells him to shut his stupid mouth up because she suffers way more than him. After she explains how all her friends went on a group date and intentionally left her out of it, Kawaii asks why she would ever want to go out with an entire group and terrifies herself with the thought of it. To no one's surprise, Yusa immediately agrees with her and says he would never go on friendship dates, especially because it's always going to be at some washed-up karaoke spot. All of a sudden, he receives a call from Kagami, who then screams out an invitation to a friend date with him and a couple friends from a different school. Upon hearing this, Mayumi immediately attacks him to get the phone and reads out the message, but then Kagami sends another one with a picture of the chick planning the friend date. After Yusa admits that she looks a little cute, Mayumi and Saiaka tell him to look a little closer because she obviously added a lot of makeup to look better. As soon as they help him see what she really looks like, he realizes that it's Hayashi, the ghost addict that traumatized him when they were in the same school years ago. While he freaks out over what new type of insanity she has probably unlocked in recent years, Mayumi continues teasing him until Kagami sends one last text, saying that Hayashi does not want him at the group date. At the cafe the following day, Yusa tries to figure out why a friend he once helped would go this far just to avoid him, but then he hears Kagami's voice and gets shocked when he sees the entire friend group. Around the same time, Mayumi gets tired of having a wholesome Saturday, so she starts a fight with Saiaka until Sumiko suggests going to the cafe to watch Yusa work. After getting Kawaii to agree to it, she spends a couple minutes dressing her up and leaves the others in shock when they see how good she looks. Back at the cafe, Kagami has just explained that Yusa and Hayashi were once classmates, but she immediately tells them that they never spoke to each other, despite seeing that she is trying so hard to look cool. Yusa still tries to ask how she has been, but she completely ignores him and heads inside a dining room with her new friends. Several minutes later, Kurokawa returns from serving them and says he will never make the mistake of attending to rich snobs who think they are better than everyone. After Yusa also tells Yamamoto that he can't serve them, Yamamoto tells them to sit back and watch his professional serving skills, but he returns just a few minutes later and explains how they traumatized him. Just then, one of Hayashi's new friends comes out to ask for more food, and upon seeing Yusa, he specifically asks to be served by him. By then, Kawaii and the others have just arrived at the restaurant, but they end up taking way too long to enter because of Kawaii's social anxiety. Minutes later, Hayashi's friends notice how weird she has been since he sat with them, so they start asking if anything happened between them in the past. When she suddenly tells them about his nickname and claims she just wants to avoid his weird energy, they start clowning him and apologize to her for thinking she was ever friends with a weirdo. As they continue laughing at him, Kagami tells Hayashi to drop the act, while Mayumi and Saiaka wonder why he hasn't said a word to stand up for himself. The next moment, Kawaii walks in and tells him to come join them in another room, and after a couple seconds of shock, Hayashi's friends resume their teasing and ask if he gives special service to all the local baddies. This finally causes him to flip out, but just as he turns to attack them, Kawaii says that she actually wants the special service and tells him not to take too long before walking out. The next moment, Saiaka and Mayumi activate ratchet mode and smear their plot cannons all over him while claiming to miss his monster glizzy. After making sure the boys feel jealous, Saiaka rips off Hayashi's fake lashes to expose her and immediately acts like it was an innocent mistake, while Mayumi drags Yusa out to a corner to teach him how to stand up for himself. As soon as she concludes the lecture, he rushes to the other room to give Kawaii her special service, but gets heartbroken when Shiroaki explains how she got cold feet and ran home. At home later that night, Kawaii notices that Sumiko made his favorite, so she starts telling him the best places to start in her books to cheer him up. As he then tries to hide how excited he really is to get extra attention, Mayumi decides to ruin his fun by saying he is clearly still thinking about her milkers. Days later, Yusa gets on a call with Kagami to warn him about his newfound obsession with Mayumi, who coincidentally happens to be displaying the usual madness on Shirosaki's head. After saying that her melons are not worth the trauma, Yusa hangs up to ask why she is having another mental episode, so she reminds him that no one else in her age group is sitting at home all alone. She then promises to make sure they all suffer along with her and orders Shiro to tell Kawaii all of Yusa's creepy secrets. So Yusa holds him down until Sayaka and Kawaii come out to ask what all the noise is about. After a couple minutes of hitting her bottle on Shiro's head, Mayumi finally explains how another coworker finally got a boyfriend, which makes her the only person in the office with no love life. Instead of comforting her, Sayaka asks if she had started picking out cats to keep her company and ends up taking more of a beating than Shiro did. Several minutes later, they also ask why she has been riding on Shiro's neck, so she tells them it's the only way she can feel slightly above them since every other part of her life has gone up in smoke. Just as she starts complaining about her failed relationships again, Sumiko shows up with an old guitar she found and Sayaka immediately recognizes it as the one Mayumi got when she first fell in love. After remembering how it also ended in tears and heartache, Mayumi suddenly climbs up the roof and proceeds to start a sad concert to spread her sadness. While Sumiko and Sayaka quickly set up a mat to enjoy the show, Yusa sees Kawaii deep in a book as usual, so he walks over to ask how she can be so focused with everything going on around her. She then claims to have gotten used to it, so he asks what life was like before she moved to the dorm, and she explains how peaceful it felt to live with her mom until she traveled out of the country for work. A couple hours later, Mayumi finally stops singing and actually accepts that she is the reason guys keep using and dumping her whenever they want to. Upon hearing her taking accountability for once, Yusa genuinely gets concerned for her mental health and asks her to climb down. Sayaka and Sumiko then admit that they both enjoy always being around her even if she occasionally acts like an escaped nutcase. After Shiro and Kawaii also join in to talk her out of whatever foolishness she was planning, she thanks them for the sweet words and decides to keep hoping for a miracle in her love life. Much later, Yusa wakes up to a loud voice screaming and quickly goes out to check, only to end up right where he has always wanted to be, under Kawaii's jugs. The next moment, he sees Mayumi, who also ran out in the most spicy plot armor, and completely loses it since he has never seen her look so good. Minutes later, Shiro also wakes up and asks what happened. So Kawaii tells them how a centipede straight from hell suddenly dropped on her book while she was reading. She immediately ran to Sumiko's room, but her collection of horror movie dolls only made matters worse. So Kawaii rushed to Mayumi's room but tripped on her while trying to ask for help. She then held up a used plot armor to show how long the centipede was, but Mayumi's night blindness caused her to think it was the real deal, so they both took off running again. Minutes later, Shiro tells them not to bother looking for Sumiko because she won't be coming back until tomorrow. Upon hearing this, Kawaii loses it and starts begging for their help, but then Shiro tells her not to worry because he knows exactly how to deal with centipedes. However, since they are not permitted into the girls' area, he tells them to handle it like strong, independent baddies. So Kawaii immediately turns to Yusa and works her magic until he agrees to slay the beast for her. For starters, they decide to check Mayumi's room, but upon seeing that it looks like the lost and found, they immediately head over to Kawaii's room for fresh air. While Shiro, Mayumi, and Kawaii try to find the book it fell into, Yusa's obsession with being in her room causes little Johnny to wake up, so he quickly sits on the floor to hide it. Thankfully, having a fun-sized pickle gives him an advantage as he easily hides it away and joins them to look. After mustering up enough courage to flip the book open, they all nearly pass out upon seeing that it has already escaped. So Mayumi immediately drags Shiro along with her for safety. Yusa, on the other hand, ends up following Kawaii around like a lost puppy. But when they get back to the porch, he sees the centipede drop and immediately holds his mouth shut because it fell right on her cakes. When she turns back to keep looking, he slowly inches closer to smack it off, but then she turns again at the last moment and feels all its legs crawling up her back. She immediately tries to pour all the hot water on herself out of fear, but Yusa quickly grabs her and ends up burning himself before managing to calm her down since it already fell off while she was screaming. Just as she finally chills out, Mayumi sees the centipede and nearly passes out, but Saiaka suddenly soaks it in hot water and wraps it up in a plastic bag. Moments later, they all decide to head back inside, but just as Yusa tries to leave, Kawaii sees the blister on his arm and holds him back before running to get an ice pack. The following day, he notices that Mayumi is still feeling depressed and tries to cheer her up. However, when Kagami suddenly shows up to ask about her, he immediately tries to chase him off for his own safety. Just then, Mayumi comes out to see what all the noise is about, so Kagami immediately drops his best pickup line and asks her out. as his affection instantly boosts her self-confidence. Yusa forces Kagami to leave and tells Mayumi not to even consider it since his Excalibur is still immature. Mayumi then claims she would never go that far for attention, and they all choose to ignore her obvious lie to focus on a more pressing issue, which is the fact that Yusa apparently knows how big his buddy's pickle is. Several days later, Yusa tries to enjoy one of Kawaii's books in peace while dripping buckets, but Mayumi and Shiro naturally start teasing him since he obviously just wants her attention. Shortly after this, he enters the cafe and realizes that he has actually been enjoying the job a little bit, until Yamamoto and Kurokawa start displaying their mild insanity over a new bookshelf tab bought for the cafe. While stacking books several minutes later, Yusa begins to consider inviting Kawaii on a date since she can't resist books, but upon realizing that they don't have enough books to cover every shelf, he senses the universe cooking up a scheme to support him. After Sumiko calls Kawaii to ask if she can lend some of her books to Ta, she happily says yes after hearing about the free coffee tickets and other books Ta already has at the cafe. Back at the cafe minutes later, Ta tells Yusa to wait for them outside because Shiro has to bring all the books in his vehicle, so Yusa rushes out to see what kind of car the shameless creep drives. However, after seeing that it's just a wagon, he decides to stop expecting anything good from Shiro and focuses on carrying the books. Moments later, Yusa finds Kawaii tweaking out at the bookshelves and convinces himself that it's perfectly normal behavior before proceeding to serve her some tea. After seeing that she is way too engrossed in the book to listen to his rants, he spots Shiro's head outside the window and rushes over to ask why he is out in the heat. As soon as Shiro says he is trying to receive punishment from the sun, Yusa shuts the window to avoid having to deal with another psycho. But just a few moments later, Shiro sees Hayashi peeping from the window and asks why a retired ghostbuster is sneaking around the restaurant. She immediately pulls away from the window and grabs a seat beside him before saying that she has been feeling extremely bad after what happened the other night. When Shiro asks what her life was like when they were in the same school, she thinks back to Valentine's days a couple years ago when she wanted to give him some chocolate and overheard two girls in class talking about how he only talked to her out of pity. The moment they left, Yusa finally showed up and asked what she was holding, but she was too embarrassed to give it to him and claimed she just wanted to tell him a ghost story. Just then, Yusa rips open the window to yell at Shiro, but upon seeing her, he tries to figure out what she wants, while Mayumi and Saiaka prepare to finish what they started the other night. When she suddenly starts apologizing and thanks him for being the only one that spoke to her back then, he quickly loses all the anger and accepts her apology, but Mayumi immediately smacks him for being too easy. Moments later, she enters the bathroom to clean off her mascara, and Mayumi, who initially planned to cuss her out with Saiaka, starts feeling pity because she had to give up her snobby boyfriends to come apologize to Yusa. After cleaning off the makeup, Hayashi then acts like it's no big deal since she can easily get more guys with her good looks, but Mayumi immediately tells her to stop deluding herself into thinking that makeup will fix her mid-looks. Just then, Kurokawa shows up to give Hayashi a toy she left behind the other night and also tells her to pay more attention to her guardian spirit, causing her to think she just found her ghost-loving hubby. Later that evening, Kawaii returns to the hostel with her book, so Sumiko asks if she enjoyed reading at the cafe, but she claims she barely read anything and heads inside. The next morning, Yusa stops her to ask questions about one of the books she gave him, and as she starts helping him understand some of the complex words, Shiro shows up with Mayumi to ask if he is planning to write his own freaky novel. After telling them that it's for his summer assignment, he gets worried that Kawaii will get creeped out by their cultured jokes, but thankfully she decides to stay just because the book he is reviewing is one of her favorites. Moments later, he tells her how the cafe became a lot more popular because of her books, and she initially gets excited until he says that Hayashi has also been coming over a lot to read. While Mayumi starts getting jealous of the relationship she is likely building with Kurokawa, Yusa continues explaining how easy his job has become before heading out. Mayumi then tells Kawaii that he has become even nicer than usual since he started the job, and just as Shiro starts losing control of his unholy urges, Chinatsu shows up and claims that she wants to cure his loneliness by letting him do all the work for her summer project. After she complains about not having any materials for her project, he grabs a bucket of mud and asks Mayumi for some of her worn-out plot armor. She immediately attacks him for being so bold about it, but while rolling mud balls minutes later, he explains how old silk helps to make it smooth. Minutes later, Shiro sets all the balls down to dry and serves up an easy bowl of soup before telling them that Sumiko went out for an errand. When he and Mayumi start talking about how Saiaka is probably out on another date, Chinatsu suddenly gets excited and asks for all the details, but then Shiro sees that Mayumi's mud ball cracked, so he breaks the bad news. Moments later, they head back outside for the final shining, but Chinatsu continues thinking about dates and suddenly asks Kawaii why she hasn't gone on a date with Yusa. After a brief moment of shock, Kawaii asks why she would even think they were a thing, so Chinatsu explains how the extra attention he gives her definitely means he has feelings. Upon hearing this, Mayumi and Shiro wonder what kind of psycho she is because none of them have ever even considered being so open about Yusa's obvious obsession with her. However, when Kawaii claims that he only sees her as another weirdo he has to look out for, their shock turns to anger as they wonder why she can't accept the obvious fact despite being so obsessed with cheesy romance books. This causes Chinatsu to accept that she might not know everything about Yusa, but then Kawaii mentions the fact that he also pays attention to Hayashi, so Chinatsu asks if she is jealous. She immediately tries to deny it, but Chinatsu presses even harder until Mayumi gets pissed and tells her to stop. Hours later, Yusa returns and immediately gets worried when he sees Chinatsu kneeling behind Kawaii, so he tries to ask if she is okay, and she responds with the meanest look he has ever experienced before walking out. After Mayumi explains how Chinatsu basically ruined his love life, Sumiko returns from decorative bread classes, and Chinatsu immediately decides to learn that instead of Shiro's mud balls. While watching a pet show several days later, Yusa asks Sumiko if they are allowed to keep pets in the hostel, and as soon as she says it won't be a problem, Mayumi says she will never get a pet because it might make her forget how miserable she really is. Saiaka then tells her to try getting one cause it might reduce her need for attention and the desperation that makes her jump on every new guy that asks for her number. Minutes later, Mayumi starts to consider getting a rabbit and becomes convinced that learning a little bit of contentment will fix her love life. But then Saiaka tells her to forget about it because she might be too old for a relationship by the time the pet fixes her issues. While they both start fighting, Yusa asks Kawaii if she prefers cats or dogs, but she gives him a cold response to shut down any chance for a conversation. Luckily, Sumiko swoops in to save him by asking about her favorite dog breed. As soon as she starts talking about it, Yusa tries to slide into the conversation, but then Saiaka suddenly says she should take care of him like her favorite dog. The next moment, Kawaii gets embarrassed and runs off, but just as Saiaka tries to tease him like always, a nerd named Miharu shows up at the door asking for her. Saiaka immediately runs to ask why she is here, so Miharu explains that she was just in the area before asking if she can spend the night. As Yusa and Mayumi immediately start laughing, she keeps trying to chase Miharu away until Sumiko welcomes her to spend the night in Sayaka's room. On the way inside, she spots the nail bat in the girls' hallway and tries to explain how Sayaka used it to destroy a shed, but Sayaka quickly holds her mouth shut to keep her secrets hidden. However, when she continues telling them to take her bags back outside, Miharu tells her not to bother feeling shy if she still reads boy love manga. Upon hearing this, Yusa and Mayumi realize that Miharu knows things that will finally change the way Sayaka always dominates them, so they take her to the living room for a long chat. When Yusa asks how they even met, she tells them about the day she rescued her from bullies at school, but Mayumi suddenly stops her and says she doesn't want to hear anything good about Saiaka. Miharu then says it was actually embarrassing because it was the day she destroyed a shed, but what actually made the bullies scared was how Saiaka looked without makeup. After also explaining how she got locked in the shed for stealing eggs, Miharu starts feeling drowsy and complains about how Saiaka is always too busy with her boyfriends and girlfriends. As Yusa and Mayumi get shocked by the fact that Saiaka is a scissor master, Miharu passes out, so Saiaka finally reveals how important their friendship is before tucking her in for the night. The next morning, she wakes her up for her high school reunion and spends most of the morning giving her a makeover to make sure her exes from school regret dumping her. Afterwards, she thanks Yusa and the others for their hospitality, but they all become terrified of Sayaka's makeup skill and wonder what horror lies beneath her own makeup. 3 days later, Sumiko walks over to her door to wake her up because the bunny she is watching for a friend is missing. Sayaka then tries to get up, but as soon as she sees the bunny, she bolts out of the room and falls on Yusa, who almost pisses himself as he never expected her morning face to look so hideous. At the school library the following day, Yusa spends a couple minutes calling Kawaii before she finally responds and says she just found her best book of the year. On the way home moments later, she starts reading it again, so he decides to satisfy himself by staring like always. Just as they get to the traffic lights, he steals the opportunity to hold her back and acts like he just wants to keep her safe. However, as soon as they get back to the house, Mayumi notices the creepy look on his face and asks if he finally had his way with her hot bod. Just then, he notices her panicked expression and asks if it was because he held her back, but by the time she explains that she just got to an emotional scene in the book, Mayumi has already cracked open his skull. Sumiko then asks about the book, so she starts explaining it with excitement, which surprises Yusa since she doesn't give him the same energy anymore. The next day, he keeps pondering over the state of their relationship while watching her in the library, so Kagaoni reminds him that they actually have work to do. Just then, a chick named Mayumi shows up to talk to her, but Yusa notices that Kawaii is already in the zone, so he rushes past them as loud as possible to bring her back to reality. He ends up regretting this because instead of the usual cold shoulder Kawaii gives everyone in school, she starts a conversation with Mayumi and manages to keep it going since she also knows a thing or two about books. As the week progresses, Mayumi ends up stealing every bit of Kawaii's time from Yusa and eventually takes their special walk home as well. While walking together, she starts asking Kawaii a bunch of questions about her life in the hostel, and as soon as Kawaii mentions that there are guys living there as well, Mayumi asks if she has feelings for any of them. After she denies it, Mayumi suddenly asks to see the hostel, so Yusa, who has been stalking them, quickly runs past them to get home first. Moments later, he gets home and immediately spins a story about seeing a party filled with handsome doctors. When Kawaii finally shows up with Mayumi and Saiaka step out with their best fits and tell her not to wait up before heading out. Meanwhile, Yusa, who has just finished tying up Shiro, starts feeling bad as he considers the fact that he really doesn't mean anything to Kawaii. Later that night, they all get shocked when her phone rings since she literally has no friends, and as she starts texting Mayumi, Yusa gets even sadder because she managed to accomplish something he still dreams about. However, after a couple more days of endless texting, Yusa finds Kawaii in a dreadful state and wonders if she is actually enjoying this new relationship. At school the following day, Mayumi suddenly asks if she wants to hang out with a couple friends who also read, and when Kawaii tries to pass, she insists that they are all like-minded, so Kawaii ends up agreeing to it. Hours later, she meets up with them near the library, but then they suddenly change plans and take her to meet with a couple guys at the train station around the same time Saiaka returns from a date. Upon getting home minutes later, she tells everyone about it, and Yusa immediately gets worried because Kawaii definitely isn't the type to chill with strangers. Meanwhile, she has just learned that Mayumi wanted to bring her to a karaoke place, so she starts panicking and tries to figure out an escape plan. Minutes later, Yusa starts imagining how Kawaii is probably already struggling to fight off a random creep, so Mayumi tells him to relax because she can definitely take care of herself. While he continues freaking out, Kawaii finally musters the courage to ask Mayumi if her friends really like books like she said. As soon as Mayumi says they are all certified nerds, a guy named Mitsui assures her that he is definitely a book lover before telling her his favorite scene from a book she just started reading. This causes her to get a little intrigued, so she decides to listen to him a little more until he starts bragging about how some random chick who only reads magazines tried talking to him a couple days ago, as he goes on to rant about how people who don't read shouldn't even bother asking him for recommendations. She thinks back to all the times Yusa asked for help understanding her novels. Just then, Mitsui asks if she feels the same about non-readers, and she immediately says no before explaining how wrong it is to make people feel bad for trying to learn something new. The next moment, Mayumi reminds her to tone it down, so she tries to apologize, but then he starts rubbing her head and says he likes how feisty she is. Upon hearing this, Kawaii pushes his hand away, but then he tries to pull her in closer, so she starts fighting and runs out the moment her phone starts ringing. After seeing that it's from Mayumi, she considers sending a text, but then she receives one and learns that it's actually Yusa who just used Mayumi's phone to check on her. So she responds saying that going with Mayumi was a bad idea but tells him not to worry. Just then, Mayumi runs out to take her back inside, but she decides to head home instead and quickly catches the next bus. Upon getting to her stop, she meets Yusa, who then says he doesn't want her to walk alone since it's already dark out, so they start heading home together. He then notices her full bag and asks how the hangout went since she clearly prepared for it, so she starts explaining how stressful it was dealing with Mayumi over these last few days. When he suddenly reminds her of the time she lost it with him for trying too hard, she gets embarrassed and says it was his fault before asking if she has to do the same thing to Mayumi. After giving it some thought, Yusa then tells her to try being a little subtle since she was probably just trying to make a new friend. At school the next day, Mayumi shows up as usual to suggest another hangout, so Kawaii quickly shuts it down and asks why she tricked her. Mayumi then admits that it was because she knew Kawaii would never agree to hang out with the guys and says she wanted to set her up with Mitsui because he hasn't stopped talking about her ever since she sent their photo to the group. This confuses Kawaii, so she asks what photo she is talking about, and Mayumi tells her about the quick selfie she took sometime during the week. The next moment, Kawaii loses it and tells her to never do something like that again before also saying that she has to stop forcing her into things she doesn't like. Upon realizing that she forgot to be subtle, she tries to apologize, but Mayumi beats her to it and admits that she recently had an issue with a friend because of her impulsiveness. So Kawaii tells her to try apologizing to said friend. Back at the house that night, Kawaii regains her peace and quiet but notices a weird feeling in her chest when Mayumi skips their usual texting time. The following evening, Yusa finds her still sitting by herself in the library and realizes that she was waiting for Mayumi, so he calmly reminds her that it's already past closing time. While heading down the stairs moments later, they see Mayumi running by, so Kawaii waits and overhears her talking to two new friends about how she was just too antisocial to maintain a relationship. Shortly after this, she starts walking home with Yusa, but somewhere along the line, she loses control of her emotions and starts crying. Yusa then tries to comfort her, but she tells him not to worry and claims it was just an emotional scene from the book. However, Yusa still gets extremely worried and fears that he might have just kick-started another period of depression until they get back home and find Mayumi losing her senses over a mixer that she wasn't invited to. After her mental episode reminds them that their life is already filled with enough drama. They get changed and meet up in the living room later on to drink plum wine with Sumiko and everyone else. Unfortunately, they end up getting the juice form because the alcohol content in the wine would deep fry their inexperienced livers. After Sumiko explains how her friend aged it for over 5 years, Mayumi thinks back to the relationship she was in back then and suddenly gets excited because her man at the time was packing an elephant's trunk. Just as she starts the usual argument with Saiaka, Kawaii gets upset the fact that she at least has friends despite being an extremely unlikable person. Mayumi then tries to argue with her instead but gets shocked when she realizes that Kawaii is actually drunk. As soon as she hits the floor, Yusa starts considering the fact that it might finally be his lucky day to take her flawless plot cannons for a spin, but the girls quickly pull her aside to keep her safe from him. Out of pity, Mayumi then decides to put on a show for him, but he instantly dries up from irritation and asks for bleach to erase the memory from his brain. The next moment, Kawaii tells Saiaka that she also doesn't deserve a friend like Miharu because she is even more of a scumbag than Mayumi. When she suddenly asks why she can't get a friend who thinks alike, Sumiko hands her a glass of water and promises to hear whatever she has to say. So Kawaii explains everything that happened with Mayumi. After Mayumi tells her that it was never going to work out between them anyway, Sumiko and Saiaka take turns explaining how compatibility works until she learns that sharing the same interests with certain people won't make them good friends. When she suddenly remembers Mitsui and gets pissed that she didn't smack his beaver teeth out, the girls ask if she had an intense argument, but she explains that it never got that far. Yusa then breathes a sigh of relief and says he is happy she doesn't have a temper, but then she suddenly gets pissed at him and starts yelling about how he never stands up for himself even when someone brutally disrespects him. After also scolding him for not quitting his job and giving Hayashi a cold shoulder for the way she treated him, he asks if she wants him to stop talking to her completely. She tells him to stop changing the subject before suddenly getting up and saying she wants to go buy some snacks. Sumiko then tells her to forget about it because it's way too late, so she starts sulking on the table until Yusa offers to grab some snacks from his room. Just as he gets up to leave, she grabs his shirt and asks to tag along, causing him to think it really is his lucky night. Unfortunately, Mayumi and Saiaka crash his party once again, so he ends up spending the night in the living room after they fall asleep in his room. The next morning, Kawaii wakes up and gets hit with a strong wave of regret as all the memories come rushing back. She then spots a journal on his table wedged between her favorite book, so she starts reading the notes while he listens from the door and prays she doesn't find the box under his table. When Mayumi wakes up and starts asking to see the journal, she quickly runs out, and he immediately snatches it away from her before running to stop Kawaii, who then starts laughing because of how funny his notes were. After letting her get it out of her system, he asks if she will continue making suggestions after he reads each chapter as a better way of talking about books, and she responds by getting red in the face and running off. Instead of giving up, Yusa stops her and asks for her number so he won't have to use Mayumi's phone in case something else happens in the future. Just then, his confidence completely vanishes, so he tries to act like he will be okay if she says no. But thankfully, she sends over her details and quickly runs off to avoid Mayumi, who then attacks him for trying to turn her only safe space into a reminder of how lonely she is. With Kawaii's digits now in his cell, will Yusa finally be able to pull the all-night freak off he has been dreaming about? Comment part 2 to find out, and don't forget to leave a like and turn on post notifications after subscribing to make sure you never miss any of our videos.